If you grew up with the NES, Kirby's Adventure probably felt a little different from almost everything else on the system. It showed up late, long after most kids were already talking about the Super Nintendo. It was bright, colorful, and unusually smooth for an 8-bit game. And instead of starring a tough action hero, it starred a small pink character who won fights by inhaling enemies and copying their powers. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the complete history of Kirby's Adventure on the NES, how it came to be, why it pushed Nintendo's aging hardware so far, how it helped save HAL Laboratory, and why it's still remembered as one of the most technically impressive and influential games ever released on the system. Let's get into it. To understand Kirby's Adventure, you first have to understand HAL Laboratory. HAL was founded in 1980 and quickly became one of Nintendo's most important partners. Throughout the 1980s, HAL worked on a wide range of projects, often acting as a technical support studio that helped Nintendo experiment with new ideas. But by the late 1980s, the company was in serious financial trouble. HAL had taken on too many projects, mismanaged its resources, and accumulated heavy debt. Inside the company, the pressure was intense. Developers were being asked not just to make good games, but to make something that could stabilize the studio's future. Creatively ambitious, but economically vulnerable, HAL needed a hit. And most importantly, they needed a game that could appeal to a wide audience. That pressure led directly to Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy. Released in 1992, Sakurai designed Kirby with accessibility in mind. He wanted a character that even inexperienced players could enjoy. Kirby could float, recover from mistakes easily, and defeat enemies by inhaling them, rather than relying on complex inputs. Notably, Kirby couldn't copy abilities yet. The design was intentionally simple, almost minimalistic, but the gamble paid off. Kirby's Dream Land sold well, and gave HAL something they desperately needed: a recognizable mascot tied to a successful game. With Kirby established, HAL immediately began planning something bigger. If Kirby could work on Game Boy, what could he do on the NES? By the time development on Kirby's Adventure was fully underway, the Super Nintendo was already on store shelves. From a marketing perspective, that made the decision to invest heavily in an NES game feel almost backwards. Nintendo itself was pushing 16-bit power, Mode 7 visuals, and a new generation of experiences. But internally, the NES was far from dead. Millions of players were still actively using the system, and many families hadn't quite made the jump to new hardware. For Nintendo and HAL, this presented a unique opportunity. Rather than competing directly with early SNES titles, Kirby's Adventure could serve as a final showcase, a reminder of just how far the NES could be pushed when developers fully understood its limits. There was also a creative reason. Developing for the NES forced discipline. Memory limits, sprite restrictions, and color constraints required careful planning. Instead of leaning on raw power, HAL focused on clarity, animation, and responsive controls. Every frame mattered. Every sprite had to earn its place on the screen. In many ways, Kirby's Adventure benefited from arriving late. HAL had years of experience working with the hardware, and the result was a game that felt confident rather than experimental. It wasn't trying to prove a concept, it was refining one. Sakurai took on a much larger leadership role for Kirby's Adventure, and with that came a defining idea. Kirby needed depth without losing accessibility. Instead of simply inhaling enemies to defeat them, Kirby would now copy their abilities. This change fundamentally altered how players interacted with the game. Each enemy wasn't just an obstacle, it was a potential tool. Swallowing a sword-wielding foe, and Kirby gains a blade of his own. Inhale a fire-based enemy, and suddenly he can shoot flames. Spark, beam, wheel, ice. Each ability didn't just add power, it added choice. Players could approach the same section of a level in completely different ways, depending on what they carried with them. What made this system special was how forgiving it was. Losing an ability was never catastrophic. Another enemy was usually nearby, encouraging experimentation instead of punishment. This stood in stark contrast to many NES games, where a single mistake could mean starting over. The copyability system taught players a new way to think about action games. Success wasn't about memorizing patterns or executing perfect jumps. It was about trying things, observing results, and adapting. That philosophy would later become a defining trait of Sakurai's design work. Visually, Kirby's Adventure is often cited as one of the best-looking NES games ever made, and that reputation is well earned. HAL used the MMC3 memory mapper, which allowed for more advanced effects like parallax scrolling, smoother animation, and richer color usage. Sprites were large, expressive, and animated, with an attention to detail rarely seen on the system. Backgrounds featured layered movement and subtle visual tricks that gave levels a sense of depth. Kirby himself was a technical showcase. His many facial expressions, smooth animations, and constant visual feedback gave him more personality than most NES protagonists. Screen transitions were fluid, enemy designs were varied, and nothing felt static. This wasn't accidental. Kirby's Adventure benefited from being developed late in the NES lifecycle, when developers fully understood the hardware and knew how to push the NES to its limits without breaking it. Kirby's Adventure is structured around themed worlds, each with its own visual identity and mechanical ideas. Grasslands, deserts, clouds, lava-filled stages, and mechanical areas all appear, but none overstay their welcome. The difficulty curve is intentionally forgiving, but the game hides optional challenges throughout. Hidden switches, secret doors, and bonus stages reward players who explore and experiment. Replayability comes not from difficulty spikes, but from curiosity. Boss fights follow the same philosophy. They're fair and designed to reinforce mechanics rather than overwhelm players. Winning feels satisfying and not exhausting like other NES titles at the time. The soundtrack to Kirby's Adventure, composed primarily by Hirokazu Ando and Jun Ishikawa, played a huge role in defining Kirby's identity. The music is upbeat and cheerful, but it often carries a subtle emotional undercurrent. Tracks like Green Greens become instantly iconic, helping Kirby stand out in Nintendo's lineup. Even darker stages retained a sense of whimsy, creating a world that felt inviting rather than hostile. Sound effects were equally polished, reinforcing actions with satisfying audio feedback. Together, the visuals and music gave Kirby a tone unlike anything else on the NES. Kirby's Adventure launched in Japan in March 1993, and later that year in North America. Critics were quick to praise its visuals, animation, and accessibility. Many reviewers noted that it looked and felt closer to a 16-bit game than an 8-bit one. While it wasn't marketed as a hardcore challenge, it was widely respected for its polish and creativity. Commercially, it performed well, especially how late it arrived in the NES lifecycle. More importantly, it cemented Kirby as a permanent Nintendo character rather than a one-game experiment. Another thing to note is that this is one of the few games that came out later in the NES cycle that hasn't gone up too much in price. Collectors can still find copies of this for around $25 to $30, which is pretty good considering many of the other games that came out around the same time have gone up to well over $100 or more, making this game extremely easy to find even for collectors today. Kirby's Adventure didn't just define Kirby. It helped redefine what late-generation NES games could be. The copyability system became the backbone of the Kirby series moving forward, but its influence went beyond mechanics. The game demonstrated that accessibility didn't have to mean simplicity, and that experimentation could coexist with structure. For HAL Laboratory, the success of Kirby's Adventure marked a turning point. It helped stabilize the studio after years of uncertainty and strengthened its partnership with Nintendo. More importantly, it gave HAL a clear creative identity, one built throughout design rather than raw difficulty. The game also reshaped expectations for Nintendo platformers. While titles like Super Mario Bros. 3 focused on mastery and precision, Kirby's Adventure offered an alternative philosophy. Playfulness, flexibility, and approachability. Both could exist side by side. Decades later, Kirby's Adventure is still held up as one of the NES's crowning achievements. not because it was the hardest game on the system, but because it understood its audience and respected their time. Kirby's Adventure isn't just a late-era NES game. It was a statement. It showed that accessibility and depth don't have to be opposites, that experimentation can be encouraged rather than punished, and that even aging hardware still surprises us when it's in the right hands. If you grew up with Kirby, or you're discovering this game for the first time, it's easy to see why it still holds up. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Kirby's Adventure, let me know your favorite copy ability in the comments below. And if you like long-form retro gaming history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out the other NES documentaries here on the channel. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep on gaming.